Jon Gabriel, the Undisputed King of Stuff.
Returning to our program, I believe this is the trifecta. It is Mr. Spencer Klavan, no relation to Andrew Klavan. I always make that mistake. But he has released a new book, and it is out today, and it is called How to Save the West. Your humble host has read it. It's excellent. I really enjoyed it. And people might think, oh, this is going to be about the classics. It's kind of, I'm not really into that. I don't have a doctorate in the classics. Explain why nobody needs a doctorate to dip into these things. Because as you mentioned in the book, Western literature and the canon, such as it is, it belongs to everybody. And it's a lot of fun to read for the most part.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, John. And thanks for having me on. I think the third time is probably the charm, so I'm sure I'll get it right this time. But no, you know, I think we have really been dispossessed of a great, rich inheritance here. That's kind of how I think about it. We've been taught, you know, that the people in the past were all barbarians. They held slaves. They were nasty to women. They did all these bad things that are evil and wrong that we don't like. Or even if, you know, we don't buy into that kind of lefty narrative, we've often just been taught these books aren't for us. They're too big. They're too heavy. They're old and boring and musty. And you probably need a Ph.D. to understand them. So that's almost exactly why I wrote this book, is because I wanted people to have a way in to understanding that all of those narratives about the great texts of Western civilization, basically all of those narratives are false. They're only plausible if you've never cracked the spine of one of these books. Because once you do, you open, let's say, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you start to realize that what you're dealing with here is the record of hundreds and hundreds of years of people sitting around and asking, how do I be a good human? How do I be good at being a human being in the universe? What is the universe? What does it require of me? And these are questions that we all ask all the time, whether we know it or not. We might sit around and think, well, how can I be a good friend, right? You know, where's the country going? What's going to happen to America? And we have this assumption, I call it chronological chauvinism, that the answers which come down to us today, now, are going to be the latest, the most up-to-date, the most scientific. And what you find a lot of the times is these questions that have been around forever, the answers that have been around forever are richer, deeper, saner, and in some ways simpler to grasp than a lot of the kind of technofuturism or madcap social justice stuff that's out there today. So it's a book for getting people into that tradition.
And also, we can see modern ideas, and there's shockingly a couple of good ones out of the thousands proposed, but getting kind of based in ancient wisdom, essentially, any kind of wisdom literature, whatever religion, whatever philosophy. When you're based in that, you can very easily go, well, that's a stupid idea. No, I don't like that. No, I don't want a microchip in my head. Oh, but that other idea, that sounds cool. You know, it kind of, it helps you rule in or out different perspectives. Now, the book is kind of framed talking about the 5 crises facing the West. Why don't you briefly go through those?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that runs through this book actually is about digital technology. You know, we've come up against these incredible new machines and we think, oh, we've never been through these questions before. But as you were indicating, right, there are many instances in which, you know, we've been over this. Like these are kind of profound questions that get raised. I call them crises because they present two sort of fundamentally conflicting ways of looking at the world or choosing between various options. And the first one is the crisis of reality. I put it first because it's kind of the most basic, and it's the one that people will recognize we've been dealing with for a very long time. Basically, is there anything outside of my own personal preferences and desires and what I happen to think this morning? Is there anything else out there that stays true no matter whether I want it to or not? Even if everybody in the world decides, let's say, that up is down, is there something that says, no, actually, up is up and down is down? Good is good and evil is evil. You can't just kill people en masse, these sorts of things. And those questions are newly urgent when you can create a virtual reality machine and basically convince your senses for a moment that something completely different is going on, and basically remake the world as you choose. So I start out by making the argument that, thanks to Plato, really, and before him Socrates, we know that there has to be something stable in reality, or else everything falls apart. And so from there, we can kind of go on to asking, well, what is that stable universe and how do we live in it? And so this leads me into the crisis of the body, which is the relationship between that mind, which sees the stable and eternal truths, but the body that we live in is kind of made of flesh and operates in this very changing and impermanent world. We eventually break down and die. And this is coming up now with all these dissatisfactions we're having with not just the way we alter ourselves with digital avatars, but our transgender kind of extremist movement that we've got going on. And so I lay out some of the greatest approaches to thinking about the body and soul and the relationship between them, stuff from St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle. As we go through this, though, there are these even deeper questions that start to rise up, namely, what does it all mean? And can we believe that there really is some, absolute truth or divine mind behind everything? And we might know that we need to feel the need to, but we might also think that, well, science and evolution has kind of just disproven everything. We can account for everything by pure replication. So that's the middle chapter, the crisis of meaning. Well, if we're constantly just, evolving and developing, what is it all for? What's the purpose? And then that kind of goes together with the fourth crisis, the crisis of religion. Can we believe in a creative God who knows each of us, when science seems to be doing so much to kind of exclude that possibility from view? So once I've argued, that we can still believe, that in fact we have to still believe if we want to move forward with all of these great traditions that we hold dear, I start to then finally look at, okay, the politics, the day-to-day, what's really going on, because I do believe that America is the greatest inheritor of these traditions. It's the last best hope of the West, and that it's not a matter of indifference whether our nation civilization stands or falls. So I kind of start to argue that people should invest themselves in their daily communities and think of themselves really as personal inheritors of these traditions, which are not, they're not dependent on the outcome of the next election. They're not dependent on muscling the wheel of history backward into some ideal state. They're dependent on you and me getting up every day and in our heart of hearts, taking into ourselves the true, the good, and the beautiful, and striving to live up to them. And that's kind of where the book leaves off.
Yeah, and that's great. It's not just my preferred thing is just to sit closed up in a room and reading books and trying to avoid actually getting out in public. But it's kind of like Western civilization has left us a legacy. We've been given Notre Dame, and it's our job to build onto that. Okay, what's the next thing we can do? How do we keep this structurally sound, which it isn't really right now, and make it stronger and better for the next generation and pass it on? So it isn't like, oh, we're going back to the old days. No, we are just blessed with this incredible foundation, and take advantage of it. And the thing, I know we've talked about this before, when I started reading classics, whatever it was, like in earnest, maybe 5 years ago or so, I was just afraid, well, it's eating my vegetables, but smart people talk about Plato and smart people talk about this and that, so I should probably eat my vegetables and do it. And the first book, fortunately, I picked up was the Anabasis, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Xenophon, which is the most fun, balls to the wall, crazy adventure story I've ever read in my life. And I'm like, why haven't they made like 100 movies and a miniseries about this book? And that I was just hooked from then on. And so they're really fun, people. There's a reason they're classics. All the boring, lame books, they didn't get copied down century after century after century. The good ones, these are the ones that lasted, that are worth reading. So I highly encourage it. One thing that was really good too is a few years ago, I started noticing it was very hard to separate out if I was writing about politics or social issues going on or religion. It's like everything's blended together now. And I think you presented that very well. And it's not like, and that's why you have to go to First Methodist Church in this neighborhood that I go to. It was just like, you got to really consider these big issues, because a lot of the Western canon, that's what it's about. And a lot of them, well, most of them disagreed with each other. And that's what makes it interesting. It just kind of opens your mind and say, well, what do you think about it? And I just think it's done very deftly and honestly and openly. And it was just refreshing to see.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm touched. And yeah, that is something I say throughout the book. You know, people, you and me, and, you know, even people that don't like, you know, write and watch the news for a living, we wake up and there are these stories in the news every day that seem to just threaten like total catastrophe, whether it's the country's falling apart, or, you know, the kids are going insane, or like, you know, everybody's addicted to video games and civilization is just going to crumble at our feet. And so the reason the book is called How to Save the West is because I think people have a real fear and the real sense of paralysis. How do I do anything about this? I'm just one guy or gal. I'm here out in this world with, you know, giant questions that are bigger than me. And I think that what happens when we ask those questions is we think of ourselves as if we were like Ron DeSantis. So we're asking the question like, what law will I write tomorrow that will fix everything? Or how will I govern the state, you know, or the country? And that's why paralysis sets in, because you ain't Ron DeSantis. You and I are not these, you know, in these positions of power. Most of us, we have the vote, thank God. But, you know, there's got to be more than just that. And so people start to feel like, well, I have to fix everything to fix anything. And the point of the West as a tradition, actually, is that because it is so concerned with the vitalization of the human heart, it's concerned with what you believe personally and how you're going to go out and show up in your community, show up for your kids. You don't actually have to be Ron DeSantis to fix everything. And you, as I say repeatedly in the book, yeah, you don't have to join the church that I wish you would join. You don't have to, you know, sign up for the Nicene Creed hook, line, and sinker overnight. But you do have to ask yourself how these big questions might affect you personally in the day-to-day, in the here and now. That's what the book's about.
And on the corollary to that as well is you have a lot of people who are like, this world is insane. I'm going to get through it by reading my Bible and going to church, not reading all these old dead Greek dudes.
Oh, sure.
You know, gosh, they were pagans, for crying out loud, if they believed in God at all. What would you say to a believer? It's like, no, you really need to read these guys, and here's why.
Well, first of all, you're in very good company if that's how you feel. I mean, it's not like you're the first person to whom that notion has occurred, and it is a legitimate reaction if you believe, as indeed I do, that Scripture, the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels and the New Testament, contains the totality of God's truth, you know, at least implicitly in its, you know, if you unpack it. If you believe that, then you might well ask, well, what am I supposed to, why should I deal with these pagans and people like Aristotle and Plato, who were born into error, you know, conceived like all humanity in sin, and he just believed in multiple gods and all this stuff. And one of the things that the church has discovered, you know, so within the Christian tradition, there are resources for answering this question. You know, one of the things that people like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas have revealed through their wrestling with pagan philosophy and ancient texts is that there's such a thing as what Christians call general revelation. You know, it's true, of course, that Scripture, Christians believe, has special revelation, stuff you couldn't just figure out by intuiting things and looking at the world. But God also endowed man with a logos, which is like a little picture of himself inside of us, right? If he is the great order that pervades and dominates all of creation, then in mankind there is this microcosm, this mind that is able to do this amazing thing where you can, like, you know, look at a planet moving across the sky and make a few calculations, perform some observations, and predict where it's going to be, and then it's there, right? I mean, these are miraculous faculties that we have, and the Greeks basically grasped the fullness of what that faculty can do. And so, one thing you might say is, well, Aquinas, or Augustine, excuse me, kind of puts it in terms of the book of Scripture and the book of nature. You have these things in Scripture that only Scripture can teach, but there is another book that is always in harmony with and in conversation with that book of Scripture, and it's God's whole creation. The heavens declare the glory of God. So people who study the heavens, who think deeply about humankind and natural philosophy, are bound to have some information for you that can flesh out your picture of the world. That's why Aquinas calls Aristotle the philosopher. He's like the guy who has what you need essentially to understand God's creation in such a way as to kind of harmonize it with what you've been taught in Scripture.
And that book of nature is something, by your recommendation, I had never heard of the dude, Thomas Traherne.
Oh yeah.
I read him, and he talks about just, being ecstatic over nature and just like, this is amazing. Isn't God awesome? He wrote it more eloquently than even I just stated it. However, it's just that thing. Right. And I think growing up in the Western states, going camping with my dad and being up in the mountains and seeing the trees and the desert below, it was just like, oh, this world is pretty darn awesome. It's pretty amazing. And it kind of guides people towards the truth in just following a different path. I know, I believe, I might get the details wrong, Saint Basil the Great, saint, I think he's in the West and the East, around the year 400, he kept being asked, because he was classically trained in a Greek school in Athens, and which was not terribly Christian, and people were asked, well, why should we read these filthy pagan authors? And he said, it's just like the Jews looting the Egyptians. They took all their stuff with them into the wilderness and eventually into Israel. It's like, we can use all this stuff. God gave them some insight, and we can use this. Obviously, it's not going to supersede God or Scripture or anything. But at their best, a lot of these guys were all groping towards the same thing. There's a reason the Magi came from the East to worship Christ. It was their limited knowledge of stars. They knew kind of sort of about it, and they went, oh, okay, this is way bigger than just following star charts.
Yep, that's absolutely right. I mean, the late, great Pope Benedict has in his book on Jesus of Nazareth, it's this 3-part description of the life of Jesus. And the first one, the nativity stories, he talks about the Magi, who, we think maybe come from somewhere in the kind of Persian tradition, maybe, inheriting knowledge from the Babylonians, the Chaldean astronomers, right? And he compares them with Herod and with the other pagans who didn't, come to, Herod wasn't a pagan, but with the pagans besides the Magi who came to reject Christ. And he says what this shows about natural science, even, and the just wealth of knowledge that man is able to acquire for himself, is that the same knowledge can lead you to glory or to perdition, depending on the approach you take to it. The Magi had the humility, right, to read into the motions of the heavens, some kind of new revelation, something that was coming that was greater than anything they'd seen before. And they accepted that, and they took that into their hearts. Herod saw the exact same thing. The thing about King Herod is
he had a different reaction.
Yeah, exactly. Even the demons believe and tremble, right? Herod saw and believed that this was the announcement of the coming of the Messiah, and his immediate reaction was to snuff it out. Bring him to me so that I may worship him, quote unquote, right? And this is that's kind of in a nutshell, I think, how we should approach all of our technology today. Is like, what is this, what attitude am I bringing to this tech that can make it serve me and that I can use to serve something higher than myself, rather than, how can I use it to my own personal ends?
And it's the whole concept of technology dealing with that. And some of it's good, some of it is not so good. So just learn how to use it, and to use it well, for improving society, helping your neighbor, celebrating God, and all these things. Another thing that's very crucial that you get into, and again, it's handled very deftly. So many books that come out are just kind of these angry harangues and what the hell's going on? Get off my lawn. That's kind of what I am aiming at. I think my first great work is going to be titled Get Off My Lawn. Just vent all my frustrations out. but I have 2 daughters. They're both in college. One just started this past year, and dealing with the body problem. That's something I'm very concerned with because I'm a dad. So I don't understand what it's like to be an adolescent girl, even if other people claim to have that experience and make TikTok videos about it. However, just having them deal with the extremes of extreme quote unquote filter induced beauty and surgically enhanced beauty. And then on the other hand, well, your body doesn't mean anything at all. You can just reassemble it anytime in any way that you want. The new trend is such and such surgery. Let's get that. How do you deal with a body problem? Because I think that's just a really crucial message people are dealing with now.
Yeah. Well, I think the first step to compassion on this, and this is kind of how I approach it in the book, the first step to compassion is to understand that people have been wrestling with this problem forever. This is hard. It's hard to be in a body, especially in a broken world where death exists, right? I mean, the Christian teaching is that death wasn't supposed to exist. And that helps us, I think, to face up to the sorrow of it. You know, we are obviously more than flesh. There is just no getting around that. People have tried and tried, especially over the last 100 years or so, to say, well, it's all just a machine. You're just a chemistry set in a meat sack. Consciousness is an illusion. But we know it's wrong because it's the realest thing about us. It's the thing we experience most directly. And Yuval Noah Harari, the kind of like darling of Davos, says in one of his books, you know, given that everything works by electrical impulses and neurochemical reactions, you know, why the hell do we need to have feelings? Why do we need to feel fear? It's such a classic.
They get in the way,
question.
Darn it.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. They're just so inconvenient. And it's a classic question because it gets everything exactly backwards, right? I mean, the feelings are the whole point. The experience of life, the qualia, as philosophers call it, the color of red, not just the wavelength of light, but the way that the sunset looks. This is the stuff of life: memory, love, desire, right? And so the question is not why the hell do we need any of that stuff? The question is, since we have all of that stuff, and since it is obviously taking place at a realm that is higher than the flesh, why the hell do we need to have a body, right? Why is why is any of this just gunk attached to us, right? I mean, St. Paul talks about spirits in clay jars, right? Treasure in clay jars.
Right.
So it goes right back to the Neoplatonists and this desire to, alter the body, to get out of it altogether, to upload your consciousness into the cloud. And I think the thing we have to realize, the question, the diagnostic question that I propose in the book is, how's that working out for you? Really, really good question to ask yourself, right? If you have some fantasy.
Nietzsche fans should ask themselves that because, I'm always like, how did that go for him?
Totally. I mean, he's somebody that you can be confronted with the evidence of his own life, right? Okay, you're supposed to be a Superman, sitting around pining after this other guy's wife. Like, how's this working out for you? And similarly, right, this idea that we're going to be perfect if we just get out of our bodies. You look at the current efforts to do that, not just the transgender surgeries and the pain and the terrible damage they do to people's bodies and psyches, but all of this stuff where you graft new horns onto your head because you identify with an ibex or like it's obviously hurting people, and the promise is always but if you take it to the extreme, then it'll work, right? If you just push it all the way to the edge, then it'll be fine. You'll be in a glorious utopia. So my proposition is that's always a dubious offer. Scrap that and recover the sense that Aquinas has, that Aristotle has, that your body is not an accident and it's not actually expendable or disposable. It's not sort of separate from your soul in that way. What it is the language, the medium in which your soul expresses itself. Just like you can't have a circle in the abstract, you have to have a wooden circle or a bronze circle. You can't have a sculpture in the abstract. Your soul is what matters most about you, but it's not gonna exist except in this embodiment, except in this flesh. So we'll never perfect the flesh, but living in it and through it and investing it with all the significance that we give our souls is a sounder way to happiness, at the very least, than chopping off your genitalia or whatever else.
Right. And the body isn't everything, but it's also not just this filthy skeleton that we're stuck with until we die. It's a wonderful thing, and need to have some respect for it. Another great thing, and we touched on this earlier, it's great to talk about, okay, what do we actually do about this? As you said, I don't think I'm going to reform the syllabus of Harvard over the next year, but I can get off my rear end and help people in my community, maybe volunteer at a local school and the like. What do you have to say for that? Like things average folks can do in the here and now?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've seen lately in politics itself this amazing renaissance among conservatives, especially, if you can call us that, people that just want to live in the real world, kind of want to preserve the American way of life and carry it forward into the future. We have seen this new flourishing of like grassroots activity, the people who take the fight over CRT to their school boards and the COVID resistance stuff, that there is this new sense that actually we're not going to have some politicians save us. We're not going to fight it all out in a cataclysmic election season. We're going to actually do the work of building our local infrastructures. And so, that's, I think, very much to the good. I make that case in the book. But the other part of this is, you start to say that, and the immediate feeling is like, well, but what if it all falls apart, right? What if the big, what if the sky comes tumbling down and the American regime? And it's like, you're just counseling quietism, right? You're just saying that, you need to kind of wash your hands of it and be at peace with sort of stoic removal from, and that's a recipe for failure, because you'll never try to save the country, save the world, save the country. And my suggestion about this is not that it doesn't matter what happens to America. My suggestion is that you're only in control of your little patch of that story. And the great consolation that comes down to us from ancient wisdom on this very topic is that even though things do fall apart, and even though tragedies do happen in the political universe, the West itself, the traditions that you are fighting for every day when you get up and you go to your school board meeting, or you pray with your kids, or you make breakfast for your husband, or whatever, those things matter eternally, because they're part of a tradition that is being carried on from before this country existed, and will be carried on and picked up after this country is gone, as it must eventually go. We hope, of course, it won't be in our lifetimes, but all nations fall. That's one of the things that we learn from the Greek historians. And the point of the West is that it's able to be rescued from the wreckage. You can pick it up from the flames. You don't know who's going to do that in future generations. I mean, I always use the example of Cicero, the great statesman at the end of the Roman Republic, who wrote some of the most powerful philosophical defenses of republican government, of representative government, and the tripartite, or the mixed regime. And Cicero failed in the immediate term. Cicero was, a victim of the new regime, which was imperial and autocratic, and would have its own kind of struggles and journey, but was not what he believed to be right. If you looked at that just in the here and now, just in the kind of momentary scope of things, you would think this guy was a failure. Fast forward to the 1770s, and you've got John Adams, who since boyhood has been poring over the speeches of Cicero, never without his copy. And he stands up and makes the speech in defense of the Declaration of Independence that sets this country on its road to existence. And I just think, if that can happen, if we can believe that torch can be passed that many generations down the line, then we have no right to despair, which, by the way, is a sin. There is no option of just kind of throwing up your hands. The only option in front of you is to work each day toward the good, the true, and the beautiful as it is given to you to see, and to leave the rest to God.
Yeah, that's great advice. One thing that I'm very angry at you about is Young Heretics is slowly working its way to its end and concluding. Probably by the time this is released, it will be done. But what are your plans for the future? I'm very excited about that.
Well, once I'm done apologizing sincerely and self-flagellating and, saying my mea culpas to you, John, I am headed over to the Daily Wire, which I'm really stoked about as well. People who have watched Young Heretics or listened to it, which was my podcast for several years. It was an introduction to these great texts. I sort of called it the classical education you didn't know you'd been denied. And I was sort of inviting people into this tradition. In many ways, this book is the culmination of a lot of that work and that effort. And now I'm taking that same project basically to the Daily Wire. It'll go under a different name and it'll take a slightly different format. But their team has taken me on to just even offer, I think, deeper dives into some of this stuff because it's so rich, it's so great. We're going to put out 4 kind of big drops, big seasons of the show a year. And the first of those will be filming in March. So it's
fantastic.
Yeah.
Very, very soon. Book and a new show. Now, what about the response? We're waiting to see the response to this book. I'm sure it'll be just as positive. But what have you heard from people? Especially people who are just like, look, I don't know about all this fancy book learning stuff. I'm a plumber and I work hard and I love my family. And I frankly make better money than people with Ph.D s. But what has the response been to people who might be encountering classics for the first time through this upcoming show or Young Heretics? Because what you shared about user input has been fantastic.
Yeah, this is I'm ashamed to say that this was a surprise to me. And the reason I'm ashamed about it is because I'm out here saying, and I've said, since I was since I came of age, that this stuff is for you, that it's good for you, right? That it's not actually inaccessible, that with a little time and care, which is well worth it, you can incorporate it into your regular everyday life. And when I started Young Heretics, I thought I'll just kind of, hold this out. If you're out there in the world long enough, people say, oh, you should have a podcast. And I think like, what am I going to have a podcast about? Like I already, I do my writing. And so if I'm going to do a podcast, I'm just going to do the stuff that I love. And probably like 5 people will listen to it. It's like, it'll be Homer and it'll be the greats and the Bible and all this stuff. And it was like holding out this little morsel of food in your hand, and then suddenly people like devour your arm. Like it was so gratifying that you had people, they would message me like, oh, I'm listening to you on my tractor. Seriously,
right.
A guy comes up to me at the gym. He's a cop. He's listening to me on his beat, and like this stuff is like, that's when I feel like I'm doing what I was put on this earth to do. And I think the book is the same way. The book is written in that same spirit of like, no, you actually can grasp this stuff and you can do it, in your spare time. It will enrich your life. It will give, greater purpose and meaning to your life. And you can do it from anywhere.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a great read, everybody. How to Save the West, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. Rush out now in a buying frenzy, everybody. We are going to break Amazon and your publisher's websites. Thanks so much for being on. Really appreciate it, Spencer.
It has been a pleasure as always. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks.